Hello, everybody. It's Teresa Shaver from the Business Advisory Centre Durham, and today I'm in conversation with Denise Branton, owner of Branton Law Professional Corporation and a member of our expert network. Hello, Denise. Welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. I'm really happy to have you with us today. I've been working with Denise, and I've known Denise for probably 5 or 6 or 7 years even at this point, and Denise is a local lawyer in Whitby and specializes in corporate and commercial law, wills and estates, and real estate. So today what we wanted to talk about was really the differences between incorporation and sole proprietorship, and then just a little bit of a conversation around that. And then chat to Denise just about her business. So we'll get started with that if that's all right.
That's great.
So what is the difference between operating as a sole proprietor versus a corporation? Denise, I'll let you take it away.
Okay, so I get this question a lot, all the time, actually. So a sole proprietor is somebody who, is an individual that is carrying on business. They can have employees, but they're not using any other form of business organization other than just operating them with them, for themselves.
Right.
A corporation, of course, is actually in a legal incorporated company, and it's a separate entity. And what it creates is a corporation. A corporation really creates a veil from the owner of the company. So if you had a company name like BACD as a corporate, if it was a corporate company, then the veil is that you wouldn't see who the shareholders of the company were. So it creates a distinct separation between the owner and the company.
Right. So the questions we get all the time is, if I'm a sole shareholder of a corporation, am I still legally responsible for the corporation?
Well, you are, yes, of course. But as a shareholder of a company, the company is actually the contract holder. So if you entered into a contract with a third party, then the company itself is the contractor, basically.
Right.
So the main thing to keep in mind is that if, and this always is the question around liability and limiting your liability, is if you had a contract and somebody wanted to sue you as it relates to that contract, they would sue the corporation, because the corporation would be the contracting party, not the individual.
Right.
So that gives you a layer of protection as a shareholder. They can't come after you personally unless there's something like fraudulent that had happened. There are some factors where they could come after you personally, but really it's the corporation that they contracted with, and therefore the corporation that is impacted, and you're not personally impacted, which means your assets potentially are not personally impacted.
Right. I think that's what I hear from most people. I want to incorporate because I don't want people to come after me, right? And I think there are times where that works, and there are times when that doesn't work. Like if it's fraud, it's fraud.
That fraud is fraud, absolutely. And there's something called a trust, or a breaching a trust that you are creating with your client, so that you want to, the reality is that if somebody sued your company and your company has assets, all your furniture and your inventory and all those things, and somebody sued your company and they won that lawsuit, then they would be able to access your assets, which are all your, the cash in your bank accounts and your corporate bank account, as well as your assets. Right. So it's not just as simple as to say you're 100% protected. You are personally, perhaps, and we can get into another reason why incorporating is what we call creditor proofing. So we can talk about that too, if you'd like.
Sure, we can. So let's just move over onto the next slide. So this is a good one to talk about, because people often get confused about the name and how to protect it, and is registration protecting it? And I don't think it is. So you can maybe talk a bit more to that.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things is, when you're a sole proprietor, if you want to operate your business under any name other than your name, if I was operating a business, it would be Denise Branton. If I was going to be operating it as a sole proprietor, if I wanted to operate it as, Smith Fence Co. or something like that, then I'd have to actually register that business name, because it's not my name.
Right.
So you can't carry on, the Business Names Act says that no individual can carry on business or identify his or her business to the public under a name other than his or own name unless it's registered.
Right.
So, in terms of registration, there's a process in which you go through to obtain what we call master business license.
Yeah.
You would go through the ministry to obtain a business name, and in that process, you cannot have a name that somebody else has.
Right.
So you specifically cannot have, if it was Jonas Fencing Company and that already existed, and you wanted to have that name, you couldn't have that name.
True.
There is a layer of protection there for you from the ministry. However, there are sort of certain things that cause you not to be protected and to be protected. It's a bit, it's not as straightforward, I guess, as
Yes.
you're 100% protected if you register your name.
I get this question a ton because people go and have a look and they go, I want to be this name, but I found one in America that's already that name. And I said, well, choose a different name. You can't, just for your own liability, because it's proof that it's already out there. And even though it's not trademarked, they could still come after you and say, we're sending you a cease and desist letter because we owned the name before you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You can incorporate a company in Canada and Ontario if there's the same name in America, unless they registered that name in Ontario, Canada, no doubt. And I would never recommend that.
Yeah.
Exactly as you said, Teresa, this is a situation where if you're ever perceived by the public as being similar or as using that person's name to benefit your own business, then you're in trouble.
Right.
So, as an example, if you had a company that was called Blueberry Co. and there was already something that was out there called, Blueberry, and they were selling blueberries, and suddenly you're using Blueberry in your name, and that's part of your business. Maybe you're selling chocolate covered blueberries, for example,
Right.
and that's become part of your business. It quite likely is that you're impacting their business, particularly if you do online orders, because people are going to find you online. They're going to try ordering through you, and you're going to take business away from somebody else. So you really just want to stay away from it. It is not worth the headache that you could have as a result of
Absolutely. And I've said that to a few clients before. And I've always said, like, especially now, because we're so digital, like you cannot have the same. Don't even go down the road of even confusing your brand with someone else. It's a headache for both of you,
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Yeah, and I've seen it happen. In Whitby, I've had letters from the U.S. Sent to my clients saying, "You're using our name. Stop using our name, or we're going to sue you." And when you've already gone through the exercise of creating your brand, creating your website, and then you have to cease and desist because you don't want to face a lawsuit, it gets expensive. So just don't even go there.
Right. Great advice. The other piece I find is interesting when people don't register their business is they just go and register all the Facebook and Instagram and Twitter handles for their business name, but they don't register the business.
You can't do that.
They can't. They have done.
Yes. Yeah, I've seen that as well, where people will start the branding and their website and their social media all before they register their business name. And you're not allowed to make yourself out to be somebody else as a sole proprietor unless it's your name only. So, only Denise Branton, for example, unless you've registered your business name and you have your license to do so. And, it is something that, it's not worth it, because then when you go to register that name and you find out somebody has the name, it's gone, then you got to start over. It really just is not.
So,
yeah.
Another question I actually have is around personal services corporation or professional corporations, because that's really what yours is. And many of our clients are also like nurses and social workers and counselors, and they have a different level of corporation. Could you mention, could you talk a little bit about the differences there?
Sure. Well, professional corporation has basically more restrictions.
Okay.
It does depend on the profession.
Okay.
So lawyers, for example, a professional corporation for a lawyer, I cannot add a spouse as a shareholder to my professional corporation. Whereas a regular Ontario federal corporation, you can add your spouse and your children and all sorts. But as a lawyer, my professional corporation, the Law Society does not allow me to add a spouse. Doctors can add a spouse. So all the professions out there are different. So the different colleges of physicians and surgeons, chiropractic, uh, all the sorts of different colleges have different rules. So we have to comply with the rules around the naming, around who can be shareholders, around the restrictions of how you can operate. There's very many different sort of limitations around
Right.
how you set up your corporation. They're still registered under the Ontario Business Corporations Act or the Canadian Business Corporations Act. So the setup of them is the same. It's just that there are restrictions around how they can operate.
Right. And many times the licensing body controls what those rules are, right? So that's very
It's
important to know,
exactly.
because we
Mhm.
have quite a few clients that are physiotherapists, chiropractors, naturopaths, like they all have different
Mhm.
rules around their corporational setup.
That's right. And in terms of the different licensing requirements, so some people think that once they're licensed, for example, a lawyer is licensed to practice law, but I would only be able to practice under Denise Branton unless I incorporate a professional corporation and start using the professional corporation. So I couldn't use, some other name that I just chose at Birch Tree Law Services. I couldn't use that name. I'd have to go through this licensing process to get that.
Right. I've seen that happen even with accounting firms. They have to put forward the name that they want to choose, and then there's a whole search and everything that goes on before they get the name that they want.
Right. Right.
Right.
And the application process with the licensing body is a part of the process. So when you incorporate a company, you go, you get your approval from the licensing body, and then you go through and incorporate. So it's a much longer process. People
Right.
think that it can be done very quickly, and it really is a bit of a longer process.
Right.
And I should also add that registering an Ontario company is different than registering a federal company. Federal company, there are some more hoops and hurdles to go through. Industry Canada specifically approves your name, and you go through an approval process, and it takes a little longer as well.
Right. Why don't you explain to people why you would choose federal corporation over uh, registering an Ontario corporation?
Okay. Well, there's a couple different things. When you register a federal corporation, you have to choose the province in which you're going to operate.
Yeah.
If you're operating in all provinces, and when I mean by operation, I mean is your home base. So if you sell services from Ontario and you send those services out into the world, so you do online coaching, for example,
Yeah.
you can operate either federally or provincially because you're still home. Your home base is still, Ontario, for example.
Right.
Um, so in terms of incorporating a federal company, typically you would operate a federal company if your suppliers or your outside third parties are looking for a federal company. And there are a few other reasons, but most business owners or small business owners, if they're an online service where they're sending stuff overseas or sending stuff to the
Yeah.
US, then I would recommend that they have a federal company. It's almost an expectation on the other side of it. And the only thing is that it is a little bit more expensive. It is a little bit more time consuming to get it organized. And so there's more filing, like government filing requirements as
Right.
well. So if you don't need to get a federal company for any reason, and there's, the people that you're going to be contracting with, if they're not requiring it and there's no need, then I would say stick to your provincial corporation.
So a lot of people are under the misunderstanding that, oh, it's so much cheaper to register federally, and then that includes your Ontario corporation. But what you don't see is all the extra filings and the extra hoops you've got to go through to get that.
Yeah. So if you filed a federal corporation, you incorporated a federal corporation, you'd also have to do an Ontario corporation filing to actually operate in Ontario.
So
So
then that's two
there's,
fees of corporation.
yeah, well, it's still the same, but it is another cost for sure. And like in terms of setting the corporation up, it is also more costly. It is, and it's more time consuming. So I would say, unless you need a federal corporation for some reason, stick to your provincial corporation.
So can I ask you another question? When someone sets up a corporation, and I've had people do this where they go and do it themselves and they have no idea what all the things are that they're supposed to be doing. Like, so they don't know
Yeah.
about the shareholders agreement and the bylaws and the minute book and all this sort of stuff. And that's why you use a lawyer, because you're schooled and experienced in understanding the Corporations Act, you know?
Mhm.
Where if you fill it
Yeah,
out online
so
yourself, you don't know.
yeah, so we have clients that do that, and people are free to do that. They can incorporate their company online, but just the process of incorporation online or through, on your own does not actually organize your company. And the Ontario Business Corporations Act and the Canadian Business Corporations Act say you must have a minute book, and it must contain the organizational documents of the company. And so part also of the setup of your company is setting up your share structure.
Right.
So most individuals who set it up themselves don't understand what the different share structures are in place for, and so they will literally just put an unlimited number of common shares, and that will get you so far, no doubt. But you also are not organized, and you can operate that way. I just don't recommend it, because at some point you're going to end up having to get yourself organized in such a way that you can, if you want to borrow money, the bank's going to require that you give them copies of your bylaws, that which you then wouldn't have, or they want a copy of your certified resolutions authorizing you to borrow money, and you don't have that. So there are some limitations with doing it yourself, and they come up pretty quickly once you're a business owner. And I frequently get calls where somebody's incorporated and I have to do articles of amendment to fix their share structure. So
Right.
at the end of the day, they're spending the same amount of money anyway,
So just
in
do it
terms of
right from the
getting it.
get-go.
Yeah, yeah,
It's just worth it to be set up correctly. And yes, I've had that happen. And someone's come to my office and shown up and go, here's all these documents they sent me, but I don't know what this is. And I don't know how to read it. And I don't have to do this. And I normally send them to you
yeah,
because, like, to me,
yeah.
you know what? I'm not a lawyer. I'm not schooled in this. And that's the reason why we have a lawyer to do this. I know some people want to
Yeah,
go to their accountant, which is fine. But I always say the distinction is that an accountant learns the accounting practices of what goes on in a corporation, and a lawyer learns the corporation law, the federal law around running a corporation. Would that be correct?
yeah, that's right. And I always work with accountants.
Yeah.
So I get that question frequently, where people will call me and say, can you incorporate a company for me? And I don't have an accountant yet, but I don't need one because I just want to go ahead and do this. I'm going to do my own books. And that's fine. However, I really don't recommend that you not have an accountant, because the accountant can really advise you around, several factors that come into play around being a business owner.
Right.
You're a small business owner, so you would be, you would have small business write-offs, and there's certain things that, from an accounting perspective, that accountants can advise you of that I certainly cannot advise you about.
Right.
And so I find that it's more effective way to create a corporation is to have the accountant and the client and myself in a conversation. It actually makes everything much smoother, and I think that when you bring that team together at the very beginning, it really just has the business set up properly, and you don't get the questions around, am I using my name correctly? How do I do my invoicing? Like, people will make a lot of mistakes at the beginning if they haven't had those initial conversations and get it
Right.
structured initially.
Right. Exactly. It's one of the reasons why we just don't do it. Sole proprietorship, easy enough to set up, but
Yeah,
it's not within our scope to be setting up corporations for sure. So that's your business.
that's right.
So our next slide
Thank you.
here, let's just talk a little bit about this, because we didn't cover some of this and some we certainly did, but I'd love to just talk through some of this with you.
Yes. So I think one of the main things, and the reason why I put this slide and the next one, which is just a continuation of the same chart, is just to give you a sense of, you know, what the various factors are, and then how creating a sole proprietorship, master business license registration versus an incorporation. So I thought it would be an easy way for people to visually see it. So
Yeah.
we've talked a little bit about liability risk. Obviously, when you're a sole proprietor, you are personally liable, no doubt about it. You just are, period. Incorporation, the shareholders have some limited personal liability, but again, you're largely protected by the corporation itself.
Right.
Um, so taxation, obviously, with a sole proprietor, you are personally taxed. So at the end of the year, when you're finished your December 31st year, fiscal year and calendar year, you have taxes, and your business gets put into your personal taxes as well. And so it impacts your personal income tax. From a incorporation, it's different. There's some great tax advantages. Sometimes accountants will say, it's not time to incorporate yet. You haven't made enough money. And that's certainly a conversation to have with your accountant.
Yeah.
There are some tax advantages, though. Obviously, the corporate tax rates are different from personal income tax rates. There's a bunch of different things to consider as it relates to the benefits of the tax, and certainly something to talk to your accountant about. But clearly, there are options with incorporating in taxes, and there are no options when it's personal.
Right, exactly. And we did already talk about name protection, I think, which is pretty cool. And then the continuous existence for sure is something that people forget about when you have a sole proprietorship. It falls away and you need to go back in and register the same name again.
Right. Yes. And people forget that.
They
unfortunately. So I've had a client recently call me and say, I forgot to renew. It was a year ago. And now I have problems because somebody's trying to use my name. And, it creates a bit of a struggle around how to deal with it. And unless you diarize it 5 years ahead of time, people tend to forget. You don't get notices from the ministry about it. So you really have to be on top of knowing when you registered that business name. So if you do register business name under as a sole proprietor, I do recommend that you pick the first day of a month or the last day of a month. So it's a day that you always remember. That's always a good idea, a rule of thumb.
Yeah.
The other thing to keep in mind is that some people have asked me recently about registering a business name by a corporation.
Yes,
So,
trading as, right?
Yes. So, for example, if I was DLB Realty Corp, as an example, DLB Realty Corp owns real estate, and I want to now, under DLB Realty Corp, create DLB Property Management, but I don't want to register a new company. So DLB Realty Corp, as a corporation, would be able to register a business name called DLB Property Management.
And that business name, is that a master business license again that you get? And this is where people get confused, right?
It is. And it's owned by the corporation. So when people try to do this themselves, they frequently make this error where they say, okay, my corporation is going to be the owner of this new business name. And then they register it as themselves as the owner. So they've just done that incorrectly. So it's just something to keep in mind. If you do want to register a business name by your corporation, you can register several business names. So, some people have divisions, right? They have the fencing division and the landscaping division and the pool service division, and it's all under one company, but they have 3 different business names registered under the one company.
And that's just so that sometimes that's difficult, I think, in today's time to register 3-4 different business names, because then you're creating 4 different websites, 4 different logos, 4 different, sometimes that doesn't make sense, right?
It doesn't always make sense. It depends on the circumstances. I would say that in certain circumstances it does, because business name, if you're called DLB Realty Corp, but I get into landscaping, I want to have something as my name that identifies that I do landscaping, even if ultimately DLB Realty Corp owns it. Yeah. So, you'd want to use some handy name that sounds, has grass or trees or whatever it is in it. That's totally fine, but you would have a separate brand for that. So that would make sense.
That does.
And the thing about, maybe at that point, you're not incorporating another company. People would say, well, why wouldn't I incorporate another company in that circumstance? And the reason why is because maybe you're just not making enough money to justify the cost, which is a separate set of books, right? A separate set of accounting, a separate tax return if you incorporate a separate company, versus it's all under one company. If you're just doing a division that's just a business license.
That makes sense. Sense. Absolutely. I like that description. And then, let's talk on this one, because some people want to be able to sell their businesses, right?
Right. So you can't transfer your ownership if you personally are running this as a sole proprietor. You can transfer your assets. You can sell your assets, absolutely, as a sole proprietor, but you can't transfer your ownership in the sense of the name. Yeah.
I've seen some people try to do that, and they're like, I've bought the name. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think you can just buy the name.
you can buy the name. Don't get me wrong. You have to, basically you have to cancel your name and they're going to re-register it. So you're going to stop using your name essentially.
Right.
That's the crux of it. So you're
This
not
was
really
Kate Spade's deal, right? She actually
Yes.
sold her name.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So in corporations, though, with a corporate business, you can transfer your shares, obviously. So if you wanted to keep the same name and then transfer your shares, the name would never change. It would be literally your company is now owned by somebody else, and there's a whole host of concerns and considerations inside that transfer. But it is possible.
Yes. Okay. And then here you've mentioned access to capital.
Right.
So,
So it is one of the things to consider as a sole proprietor. There's sometimes limited access to capital versus a corporation. It does obviously depend on the business and the
right.
structure, but um, typically a corporation itself is seen as a greater. So there's, it's even if it's a perceived notion, I think everybody would agree that mom and pop fish and chips is different from the company that has the name that is a little bit more saleable,
Right.
versus and a little more attractive than just the individual.
Yes. True. Then, and I, of course, so it's much easier to change your name and address and all that sort of stuff if you are a corporation
Hmm.
rather than a master business license. So because it's a separate legal entity, right? The other one is the
That's
master
right.
business is tied to you.
That's right.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about a corporation that's great is if you want to bring in a business partner, for example, and add another shareholder to your company, it's really easy to, add a new director, you file it with the ministry, or add an officer of the company, you file that with the ministry, or change your address. Those are just all easy filings with the ministry. Then also, if you wanted to change your share structure, because you're going to add your spouse on as to be a shareholder, for example, you would file articles of amendment. It's very, very simple. It's a process, don't get me wrong,
Right.
but you can't do any of that as a sole proprietor. It's you only. It's never you and your spouse.
Right.
You can create partnerships with us as a sole proprietor. And I know we're not getting into partnerships in this conversation, but there are some possibilities, and it's just so much more limited. There's just much greater flexibility with corporations.
We do have lots of clients that actually do get into the whole partnership thing, but there's a limited partnership and a general partnership, and then there could be partnership on anything, corporation kind of thing. So it
Yeah,
gets, it's much more
there's a
complicated.
lot. They can get pretty complicated. Yeah. And the thing about a corporation is, it from a tax perspective, the corporation gets taxed. It's so much clearer. From a partnership, it's not as straightforward.
Right.
I actually think partnerships are so infrequently used these days. I find they're much more popular in the past. I think that people are not using partnerships as much and are going with the corporations and creating shareholder agreements now.
Which I think really is a lot cleaner and probably protects both parties way better.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly cleaner, and I think it's an easier. There's easier distinctions.
Right, right.
I think when it comes to operations and taxation, and even just in terms of if you have family members in your business, that's also a factor. And I think having a separate legal entity makes it an easier organization.
Good. Yes, that very much makes sense. So if I registered a master business license, am I protected, right? Is the name protected?
Yeah, I mean, it is to some extent. Yeah, right. People can't then take that name,
Right. Yeah.
but you're not trademarked,
Yeah.
right? So your logo is not trademarked. You're right. So, if your logo is not trademarked, then, or your process or your system isn't trademarked or copyrighted, right? You're in a situation where somebody else could use, like, my logo. Somebody else has a very similar logo to mine out there, and I had somebody send me a note and say, your logo, somebody has a very similar logo. Like, it's not copyrighted, it's not trademarked. So,
Right.
it is what it is.
Can be very
And
similar.
that's something people don't realize. Yeah. And I've had clients say, I want to get trademarked. And it's a pretty lengthy process. I don't do
Yes.
trademark work. I send it out. I'm not a trademark. You have to be a trademark agent to do that work. And I know there's probably some experts in this
Yeah.
network that BACD has
Mhm.
that you could refer people to. But it is a good idea if you have something very unique that you want to protect from a logo or a system and process.
Right.
Think of the big M arches for McDonald's. That's the trademark.
That's a trademark they're trying to protect. So one question I have just around that quickly. So if you want to
Mhm.
trademark something, there's a number of considerations here. There's the logo, there's the name, and then there's the
Yeah,
process, right? So there's like three
yeah,
different things. So I trademarked Do It in Durham, but it's
right,
not a hashtag, it's not a logo, it's just the words,
right. It's the words.
right?
Yeah,
So
yeah,
I'm only
yeah, and
protected from
that's
other
one thing
people.
people don't realize. Yeah, like if you look at McDonald's or Burger King, for example, Burger King has the Whopper that's been trademarked. Is it Burger King or McDonald's?
It's
Whichever
Burger
one it
King.
is. Um, they have it trademarked, the Whopper. And then they have and maybe it's McDonald's who has their secret sauce. They have a copyright for that secret sauce.
Right.
So you can't use their secret sauce unless they gave it to you. And so the same thing with their Big Mac. That's McDonald's, is Big Mac. That Big Mac is a trademark word.
Yeah.
So nobody else can use the word Big Mac. That's why Burger King has Whopper, right? So it's interesting. If you look at it like that, you can see how people have trademarked certain words that nobody else can use.
Good point.
So it's pretty
One of
interesting.
the
The other thing that
um,
I didn't talk about is creditor proofing, and one of the reasons why you incorporate as a tool for creditor proofing.
yeah.
And it is something I always talk to my clients about. One of the realities is that if you incorporate a company and that company, you're a shareholder of the company, then if you're sued, the company is sued. You're
Right.
not personally, your assets are personally protected. So if you, as an example, if you own a house individually, that's your biggest asset. It's easily found if you're ever sued.
Right.
We always recommend that. That's one of the things. If you're a sole proprietor and you're sued, your house, and you own a house, then your house is subject to being taken away as a result of that lawsuit.
Right.
And so that is one of the most significant concerns that people have, and don't realize that they're really putting themselves at risk.
Right.
And so that's one of the main reasons to incorporate a company. One other thing that people ask me is, I thought as a corporation that there is this veil. And so the concept of a corporate veil is that you're protecting it's like a veil over your face. You cannot see you personally. It's just the corporation that people are seeing.
Right.
However, there are ways to what we call pierce the corporate veil. And the most obvious party that can pierce the corporate veil is CRA.
Right.
So you cannot, you are always personally liable when it comes to CRA, no matter what. So HST, for example, if you are subject to HST, you're going to be personally liable, even if you have a corporate name. So
Right.
people don't realize that all the time. They think they're also protected from CRA, which they are not personally protected from CRA ever. CRA can always pierce the corporate veil.
Right. Good. Good
And
point
just
to
on
make.
that note, yeah, on that note, if you own real estate with a spouse, you and your spouse own the real estate, and CRA says you owe HST, CRA can register a lien on your house because you own it personally, right? You own that house personally, you owe CRA personally because they can pierce the corporate veil. So I always recommend that people really look at how they own their assets. Is it, if they're in business for themselves, consider having your spouse own the house as opposed to you also owning the house, as a protection measure. And
Right.
that's what we call creditor proofing. And so it's something that comes up in many of my conversations around, getting set up in the corporation setup.
Which totally makes sense, because lots of people do have quite a bit to protect, and that would be one of the ways to do that. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Absolutely. And it's the easiest found asset. So if you're sued personally, they're going to find it.
Denise, thank you for this information. I really appreciate it. I think it's really useful for our clients to just go through it and listen to it from a lawyer's perspective, because we explain some of the stuff sometimes, but it's always different when it comes direct from the source.
Absolutely. My pleasure. And I I really just want to remind people that every circumstance is different, and every time you're uncertain about your specific consideration, having a friend or colleague give you advice may not be the best advice for your specific circumstance. So reach out to myself or another lawyer to get some legal advice.
I would agree. Absolutely. Thank you.